Hello everyone and welcome to Medicated Housewife DIY where crafting and mental health come together. My name is Sarah. In today's DIY video, we are making a stunning piece of boho wall decor. It's a neutral and boho wall hanging with an extremely high-end look, and we're using mostly Dollar Tree supplies. And you're gonna love it, so stick around. And let's go make some stuff and jump right into this. In today's DIY video, we are making this gorgeous, trendy boho evil eye wall decor. This neutral wall hanging is super easy to make, but totally impressive. We're using Dollar Tree Nautical Rope, leftover yarns, and Dollar Tree foam hair rollers. This wall decor is in a macrame style without having to actually macrame anything. We are creating a totally customizable piece of high-end room decor, perfect for spring or any time. Super trendy and budget friendly. So let's get started. To begin with, as I've mentioned, we are going to be using some of these foam hair rollers that I got at the Dollar Tree and some nautical rope also from the Dollar Tree. I had this heather gray yarn that was already in my stash from the Dollar Tree and some thinner white yarn that I also had in my stash. I did end up buying some of this Craft Smart yarn in the colors Ice Blue, Arctic Blue, and Charcoal. And I got them at Michael's, but if you have extra yarn in your stash, the colors in this project are totally customizable. So with the exception of the white, the black, and the gray, I encourage you to use the colors that you already have. I also picked up some Red Lion yarn in black. Most of my yarns were either medium or a lighter weight, and I'm encouraging you to get the bulkier yarns because you will need to use less of them the bulkier that they are and the less work that you will have. I take 2 of the foam rollers to form the main eye shape, and 1 roller that I'm going to bend into a circle to form the iris that goes inside of that eye shape, and then another roller into an even smaller circle to form the pupil, and that's going to fit inside the iris. It's a total of 4 of the foam rollers that I'm using. The way these foam rollers are made, they are basically just a wire that's inside of a foam tube. And the foam tube is kind of like a pool noodle, but flimsier. They also have these little plastic-like buttons that are hooked onto either end. Those are easily removable. So to make the smaller circular pupil shape, I need to bend that wire into a much smaller circle, and I do that by trimming back the foam around it and then bending it and then snipping some extra wire so that I can get the circle to be small enough. When I make the shape of the pupil out of the roller, I take this masking tape and just wrap some of that around the opening where the 2 ends come together. And that's just to help them stay together and so that there are no holes or gaps, because we need a nice smooth donut shape. For the larger circular iris shape, I was able to just bend the roller into a circle, and I used a couple of drops of Star Bond glue to attach the 2 plastic buttons on the ends together and to keep that circle in shape. I then used a piece of masking tape to smooth out the connection, just like I did with the pupil shape. Initially, I also tried to use the Star Bond glue to attach the top and the bottom rollers for my eye shape, but the Star Bond just was not sticking and would not work. So in the end, I did end up using a couple of dabs of hot glue to attach the top roller to the bottom roller to form my eye shape. I did use the same wrap method with the masking tape to try and smooth out the connections for the eye shape. With the 3 eye pieces made, I decided to start the yarn wrapping. I started it with the smallest circle, which is the pupil. The pupil is going to be wrapped with the black yarn, and we are basically just literally wrapping the foam circle with the yarn so that none of that green foam roller can be seen underneath. I ended up cutting a pretty long piece of the black yarn to start out with, and I tied a knot around the foam and began pulling the yarn through the circle and wrapping it around until I had a solid black circle. I did use a tiny dab of hot glue just every so often, like maybe 3 times, just to give some added security to the yarn and to keep it from slipping off to the side. It's a small circle, so even though my yarn is not very bulky, I only wrapped the circle with the yarn 1 time around. To end the wrapping, I simply tied a knot around the circle and then I trimmed the excess. Next, I started wrapping the iris, and I'm using the heather gray yarn from the Dollar Tree. I'm going to wrap this one the exact same way as I did the pupil. I start by tying a knot around the roller, and I begin wrapping the gray yarn around. But this time I cut a long piece of the yarn off and rolled it into a ball because that made it a little easier to wrap. So I'm pulling the yarn ball through the circle. And again, you only need to add a dab or 2 of the hot glue if you feel like it's necessary. And that's just to prevent the yarn from slipping to side if you feel like you need it. And in some cases, you may not feel like you even need it, so that is your call. After I wrapped the entire iris, I did feel like there were some spots on it that looked a little skinnier than other spots. So I wrapped a couple of the skinny spots with the leftover yarn that I had. And that is why it would be easier for you if you start out with a bulkier weight yarn, because you will get a nice fat looking circle the first time around. But I did use up all the yarn I had left over, and then I tied a knot at the end and trimmed whatever excess there was. For my eye shape, I used the charcoal color yarn, which is a much darker gray than the gray heather, and I'm going to wrap the eye shape the same way as the iris and the pupil shape. I start at one end, and I definitely use a little glue to secure the yarn in some of the spots because this is not a donut shape, it's elongated, so the potential for the yarn to pull or to slide and reveal that green color underneath is there, and we want to prevent that. So a little dab of glue on some of the ends will stop that from happening. So I still made a little yarn ball to make the wrapping easier, and I start the wrapping by tying a knot around the foam roller. And I also used all the leftover yarn at the end to go back and wrap some of those spots again, because just like the iris, I felt there were some skinny spots and I wanted to fatten them up and even out the eye shape a little bit. But again, if you use a bulkier yarn, you will not have this problem. So with all 3 parts of my eye wrapped in yarn, next I'm cutting 3 pieces of nautical rope to place above the eye. And I want to cut them to approximately the same length, and I want them to hang down around 5 or 6 inches, and that's not an exact measurement. You can totally adjust that to your liking, but for me, I want the fringy rope pieces to hang down about 5 or 6 inches lower than the middle of the actual eye. So I place them in that position that they're going to be in, and I trim all 3 pieces of rope at the same time. I also take a piece of masking tape and I tape that across all 3 ropes, and that's to get a rough idea of where I want to start the wrapping of the color yarn around them. I also wanted to make sure that they are all even with each other. So I go from the corner of the eye just slightly upward with the tape because I wanted a really slight angle up for the colors to begin and then for my fringe to hang down from. With masking tape in place, I take some blue painter's tape and I use the blue tape to mark on each individual rope where I want to start wrapping the color yarn and then where I want to end it. So I mark that spot on all 3 pieces of nautical rope. I also took a pencil and I labeled the tape with a row number from 1 to 3 so that I'll know which rope would be what color. I knew my colors were going to be starting with white, then the second color light blue, then the third color the darkest blue, and this way it was easier to keep track of what's what, if that makes any sense. The first rope is going to be white, so that's the one I marked with number 1. I grabbed my white yarn from my stash, and it happens to be pretty thin and pretty lightweight, so I just planned on having to wrap the rope 2 times to get it to be the size that I wanted it to be. I start wrapping it at the taped off mark by tying a knot and just wrapping the same as I did with the foam rollers. You want to take your time and make sure your yarn isn't overlapping itself, and you also want to make sure that each time you wrap that there's no space showing through under the yarn. I try to do it as neatly as possible. I go from one side to the other and then I turn around and go back to the beginning so that my rope ends up double wrapped and a nice uniform thickness at the end. And then I tie a knot and I snip the excess off. With the white rope all done, I move on to rope number 2, which I'm wrapping with this light blue yarn. This yarn, although it's a little thicker than the white, it's still kind of thin, and I planned on doing 2 full wraps around the whole rope just to get it to be thick enough. And that's just another reminder that this will be easier for you with a super bulky yarn. I made myself another small yarn ball of the blue yarn to make that wrapping easier, and I started to wrap the light blue rope. I started the seam as the white rope by tying it on at the beginning where I put the tape. And again, I wrap carefully and slowly. And just a side note here, even though this part is a little time consuming, it's so easy to do. You could just plop in front of the TV and do all this wrapping. It really doesn't require any concentration at all. For the third and final rope, we're using the darker blue color yarn, and I began by rolling myself a small ball of yarn to work with. And I begin wrapping from the taped part of the rope, and I tie a knot and just begin the wrap. Again, this yarn is the same thickness as the light blue yarn, so I plan on wrapping this one 2 full times as well as all the other ones to get the proper thickness and to match the other pieces of rope. So now all my components are finished. It's time to put everything together. I set up the eye and the nautical rope how they'll be for the finished project, and I cut 5 pieces of the charcoal gray yarn, the same color as my eye shape, and I'm using these 5 pieces of charcoal gray yarn to tie the eye shape to all 3 pieces of rope, and to tie the 3 pieces of rope together as well. So I start with tying the one in the middle, followed by 1 on each side, and then we'll put 2 more that are spaced between each side and the middle. Once everything is tied in place, I'll double knot those gray ties on the back of the project so that you can't see them. And just a side note here, if by chance you're not familiar with this eye design, it's usually referred to as an evil eye. And despite it being called an evil eye, it's truly a symbol of protection for all. It's a sign of protection that pretty much is the same for multiple cultures. So don't let the name evil eye scare you. This is a symbol you should very much want in your home. It's really a very positive symbol. The classic evil eye is a deep blue, but other colors can protect you from specific things. So you can Google that further if you want to change the color and find out all the meanings. It's just a little tidbit of info you may or may not have known. Next, I used the black yarn to tie the pupil to the iris, but I really did not like the way that looked, so I decided to just use the ties as a placeholder until I could sew everything together in the back. So basically at this point, they are just there to hold the 2 pieces together. Next, I used the charcoal gray to tie the iris to the eye, and again, I didn't like the way that looked at all. So like the iris and the pupil, I decided to use them as placeholders only until everything could be sewn together in the back. I then turned the whole project over and I got a needle and a thread. It really doesn't matter what color because no one's going to be able to see the thread in the back of the project. I set out to sew the 3 pieces of nautical rope together first, and I tried to just superficially stitch each color and include a stitch around the gray yarn that was tying them together to keep that in place from sliding around. Keep in mind, you're really only going under 1 layer of the yarn because we don't need the needle to go very deep or to go past 1 layer of yarn in order for it to just hold everything together. And if any of you really sew, you're like a skilled seamstress or something, I apologize because I'm pretty sure the sewing skills I'm displaying here are horrifying you, like just totally horrifying you. It's probably painful for you to watch, and I'm sorry. I'm like sincerely sorry. It also should be crystal clear right about now why I do not, nor will I ever, have a sewing channel. I'm letting you see my absolute worst here, so please don't judge me too much. Thank you, that is all. Moving along, I also sew the iris to the top and the bottom of the eye shape, and then sew the pupil to the iris. And after that's all sewn together, I snip off all those ugly little yarn placeholders that I hated so very much. And I just know someone's going to leave a comment below about just how atrocious my sewing is. And I'm a little nervous, I'm not going to lie. I then took a large wood bead that I had in my stash and I string some black yarn through it, and I tie the yarn on either side of the pupil so that it stays in the middle of the pupil. And since the pupil is also black, you can't see the yarn that holds the bead that's tied onto it. Off camera, I hot glued a small piece of rope with a craft stick on top of it to the back of the project to use as a hanger. And the last thing to do was to unravel and brush out the bottoms of my nautical rope fringe. I use a dog brush to fluff them out, and then I hold the whole thing up and trim the ends so that they're all even. And this is how my Dollar Tree trendy boho wall decor turned out. I am so happy with how beautifully this came out. It has definite boho vibes and it's very trendy. I think this evil eye fits in with so many different decor styles. It's neutral and modern with a real boho flair. And just so you know, the inspiration design for this project is on Etsy for over $150, while ours is under $5. I think lots of people would love receiving this as a gift. I know one of my daughters already made me promise she could keep it, but I'm kind of attached to it, so we'll see how that goes. But this is such a super high-end look. Let me know in the comments if you would want to give this as a gift or keep it all for yourself. I hope you enjoyed this Medicated Housewife DIY, and if you did, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing. It really helps out my channel. And once again, thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm the Medicated Housewife, and crafting is my medication.